Hi everyone, it's Katrina. Number 10. Satanic Altar. In Edinburgh, Scotland, there is a place called the Queen's Holyrood Park. It's a peaceful and secluded place where archaeologists just unearthed two very creepy objects. They came across a pair of metal plaques depicting demonic symbols. Each plaque has its own upside-down pentagram with a horned monster in its center. In all likelihood, the demonic entity is supposed to be Baphomet, Lord of the Damned. The objects were also found near what appears to be an altar. The suggestion here is that archaeologists accidentally discovered a place of devil worship. The Queen's Park was established around 1128 AD by King David I of Scotland. King David used it as his own personal hunting grounds. Over time, the park shrank until it became a small royal park outside the residence of the kings and queens of Scotland. It's a place of rich history, and so what in the world was it doing with satanic symbols buried underneath its lawn? According to the report in the Edinburgh Evening News, the metal plaques and altar were embedded just beneath the topsoil. Researchers also found rune stones and other objects which have not been identified. Historic Environment Scotland was behind the discovery, though nobody can say with any certainty what exactly we're dealing with here. Some experts have suggested the symbolism is reminiscent of the Pagans, while others have argued it is more demonic in nature. We don't know how old these things are yet, if they are ancient or were buried recently by a satanic cult. For all we know, these plaques were left behind by a group of ancient worshippers of a horn-headed entity going back thousands of years. Number 9. Strange burial in Germany. In 1962, construction workers in Brandenburg, Germany, accidentally discovered some human bones. An archaeological investigation ensued, and experts found the skeletal remains of 6 people. These people died around 8,000 years ago in 6000 BC, when Germany was occupied by hunter-gatherers. In 2012, the site was excavated again. This time, researchers found 3 additional burials from around the same time. We now know this is one of the oldest graveyards in all of Germany. Human graves from 8,000 years ago are not common, so the discovery is a pretty big deal. Most finds from that period come in the form of stone tools. Mesolithic people rarely buried their dead, instead choosing to burn them. It wasn't until humans began looking at death from a more creative point of view that they made up their own rituals, religions, and other motivators to bury the dead instead of just disposing of them. There was one particular burial found in the graveyard that archaeologists found rather exceptional and a little spooky. The burial process was incredibly strange. A young man was buried standing upright 7,000 years ago. First, the man was put into a vertical pit, one wide enough so that he was kept upright by the earthen walls. Then the pit was filled with sand up to his knees, so that his body would stay upright long after he was buried. Then, for whatever reason, the grave was left open. We know this because the upper part of his body was ravaged by scavengers. The grave wasn't filled up until much later, long after the body had already decayed. Number 8. The South Uist Mummies. In 2001, archaeologists found the remains of 2 female adults, 1 male adult, and a small child. They were discovered in the ruins of a Bronze Age village in South Uist. These individuals turned out to be prehistoric mummies, and the first of their kind identified in the British Isles. They were found buried in the fetal position and had originally been bandaged and bound with cords and straps of leather. According to experts from Sheffield University who investigated the remains, they were wrapped, then strung up so their bodies would stay in the fetal position after death. Even stranger, the bodies weren't all buried at the same time. The male was buried around 3,500 years ago, and the other bodies many centuries later. The houses they were found under were 500 years newer than the bodies. Then things got even creepier. Researchers were shocked to discover one of the women wasn't totally herself. Her skeletal remains were a mix of body parts from 3 other people. Scientists went back to the male and examined his body, and they found the same thing to be true about him. Scientists are baffled by whatever happened here. These prehistoric people were dismembered and then reassembled for seemingly no reason at all. And now for number 7. But first, it's shoutout time! Big thank you to Jorge Gonzalez Larramendi for the super thanks. We really appreciate your support. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family because you know we'd love to have you. Number 7. Aztec skull masks. In the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the ancient capital of the Aztec, archaeologists uncovered terrifying Aztec skull masks. One of the greatest discoveries of skull masks came 30 years ago at Templo Mayor, located in the historic center of Mexico City. 8 masks crafted from human skulls were found in the temple. Their origins and their purpose have remained a mystery ever since. Scientists aren't entirely sure why the Aztec felt it necessary to make masks out of human skulls. We don't know if these were decorations, used in ceremonies, or some sick and twisted art project. What we do know is that Templo Mayor was dedicated to the Aztec god of war, Huitzilopochtli, after its construction around the 15th century A.D. Archaeologists have found ample evidence of human sacrifice. We know sacrifice played a major role in the Aztec religion. Extracting the heart, burning people alive, ritualistic fights to the death. It was all just part of being Aztec. But even for the Aztec, these skull masks are strange. One theory has been proposed by archaeologist Corey Ragsdale. He suggests these skull masks were decorative headpieces made from the bones of slain warriors. The back part of the cranium was taken out, the front of the skull was decorated with colorful dye, and there were even inlays to make eyes. They were likely worn during ritual sacrifices, making them just that much creepier. Number 6. Polish vampires. In southern Poland, road construction revealed 14 skeletons buried with their heads decapitated and placed in weird spots. Archaeologists have reason to believe these skeletons were vampires, or at least perceived to be vampires. 11 of these skeletons had their skulls between their knees. 1 had their skull placed between their hands, and 2 had their skulls resting on their shoulders. Almost all of them were female. Here's the thing about Slavic countries in the Middle Ages. Burying a person with their head anywhere but at the top of their neck was associated with vampirism and witchcraft. If someone was perceived to be a vampire, or a witch who might come back from the dead, their head needed to be removed. The idea was that when the person reanimated, they would soon find themselves without their head and unable to get out of their grave. Without their head on their neck, they wouldn't even be able to coordinate an attempt to free themselves. Victims of this type of burial often had their hands tied and their feet weighed down with heavy boulders for a bit of added protection. It's unclear who these people were, although it's fairly obvious who the locals thought they were. All 14 victims were most likely seen as vampires when they were buried in the Middle Ages. There was likely a vampire panic in this small village, which led to the bizarre and ritualized burials of over a dozen people. Number 5. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden was one of the most brutal torture devices of the Middle Ages. The notorious contraption, known in Germany as the Jungfer, was famously violent. A person would be placed inside a human-sized cage filled with spikes. Then, when the cage was shut, the spikes would impale the victim. That's the Iron Maiden in a nutshell. But the truth behind the creepy device is that we don't have any official accounts of it being used in medieval times. Some historians have even suggested the majority of torture devices were made up by fraudsters in the 19th century. Many of the most heinous torture devices may have never even been used. The first written testimony of an Iron Maiden being used is from the 18th century. Historian Philip Siebenkees wrote that a criminal was executed using the device in 1515, and that the spikes were designed too short to fully impale the man. It took 2 days for him to bleed out inside the contraption. However, this historian was most likely a fraud. Modern historians believe he either invented the story himself or misinterpreted a totally different medieval device called the Schandmantel, or the coat of shame. This was used by the Germans to publicly humiliate poachers and other criminals. It was a human-sized cage, but it didn't have any spikes inside it. It was just a way to shame those convicted of crimes out in the open for all the townspeople to see. Number 4. The bog body. Throughout Europe, thousands of naturally mummified corpses have been discovered in ancient wetlands. These are called bog bodies, and most of them were thrown into swamps and quagmires during the prehistoric period. Most of them also met untimely and violent ends, often being the victims of murder. Scientists are still struggling to understand why murder victims were so often tossed into swamps. Recently, scientists based at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands took a deep dive into bog bodies. They analyzed 1,000 bodies found across Europe and were shocked to see nearly all of them showed signs of overkill. These people weren't just murdered and thrown in the swamp. They were brutalized in extreme and unimaginable ways. Up until now, there have been a few main theories about why people were thrown into bogs. The most common explanation has been ritual sacrifice. Archaeologists have always figured the ancient people thought the bogs had power and gave sacrifices to the swamp gods. But that doesn't account for the extreme violence. Not necessarily. The new study has shown that for 7,000 years, certain people were killed in an absolutely heinous fashion and then thrown into the bogs. If it was the result of ritual activity, their deaths would have been performed the same way. Instead, we see violence that has a certain anger to it. The new theory is that these people weren't ritual sacrifices. They were criminals. These may have been people who broke social convention and were punished accordingly. Then their bodies were left in bogs to be preserved like human raisins. Number 3. The dancing skeleton. In Russia's Far East, scientists unveiled a skeleton from the Dark Ages. He was found in a medieval graveyard near Ust-Ivanovka, used between the 7th and 9th centuries. He was nicknamed the Dancing Skeleton because when researchers opened his grave, it looked like he was doing a little dance. Archaeologist Denis Volkov said the man had been laid to rest on his back, with his legs sprawled out and his knees crossed as if he was in the middle of a dance. Archaeologists found it bizarre because there were no burial ceremonies from the Dark Ages known for such an unusual position of a body. What makes the skeleton so creepy is that its final pose was not an accident. Researchers agree that for his limbs to have been found in such a position, he would have needed to be tied up that way. Someone wanted him to look like this. Plus, whoever buried the guy placed arrows on his shoulders as part of the ritual, while an arrow tip was found embedded in his hip. He may have died from an arrow wound, but why he was buried in such an odd way is still unknown. Number 2. Prehistoric cannibal. 800,000 years ago in Spain, prehistoric cannibals feasted on a human child. It honestly doesn't get much more disturbing than that. The victim of this horrific display of violence is known today as the Boy of Gran Dolina. However, a recent new analysis of his ancient remains have revealed he was really a girl. The young female child was a Homo antecessor, an ancient species of hominin that evolved in Europe about 1.2 million years ago. Her skeletal remains were found in a cavern in Spain's Atapuerca Mountains in 1994. When the remains were first investigated, scientists determined them to belong to a boy who was 13 years old at the time of death. The more recent analysis showed the remains are really those of a girl who died between the age of 9 and 11. To make things even creepier, the young girl wasn't the only victim of ruthless cannibalism. Researchers found 22 other individuals in the cavern who had been cannibalized. I won't get into the grimy details, but it was pretty heinous. Scientists believe the cannibalism likely resulted from pure laziness. Researcher Jesus Rodriguez says prehistoric people were well aware how nutritious their fellow humans were, and how much easier humans were to catch than other animals. Number 1. The Cursed Tomb. Archaeologists found an ancient tomb marker in Israel cursing all those foolish enough to enter. 1,800 years ago, a man named Jacob the Proselyte did not want anyone messing around with his tomb. He had the foresight to curse all those who would even try to enter it before he died. Prior to his death, he scrawled a curse across his tomb in blood-red letters. The curse read simply, "Any who open this grave will be cursed." It must have seemed at the time an effective countermeasure against grave robbers. But it turns out the curse was written in crimson paint, not blood. Sorry to disappoint. The tomb itself is at the ancient Jewish necropolis of Beit She'arim in Galilee, uncovered during the most recent excavations. The grave marker shows Jacob was 60 when he died, and that he had converted to Judaism from some other religion. Unfortunately, the curse didn't keep out all the grave robbers. According to archaeologists from Tel Aviv University, he was looted anyway after his death, and his body taken from his tomb. Jacob, the proselyte, tried desperately to curse all those who entered, only to have his body stolen and his grave pilfered anyway. Thanks for watching! Which of these amazing archaeological discoveries did you find the creepiest? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon. Bye!